The time that we live in right now is not exactly ideal. COVID happened a few years back. We're starting to not understand Gen Alpha, climate change, even more climate change. While we might not be in the perfect era, we're sure way ahead in many things compared to the last few thousand years. Unless, of course, you believe that aliens built the pyramids. Before our time, or maybe even in our time, there were parts in history where it was the worst to live in. So, I have this magic door right here that can go everywhere and everyone, if that's a word. Suck on that, Doraemon. Anyway, I'll bring you to the honorable mentions first. Precambrian Eon. Now you know why it's an honorable mention. Let me take you to a better one. Paleozoic era. Not really better, but here we are. Mesozoic era. So, what do you think? Pretty livable? Good. All you have to do is escape the dinosaurs like the Croods and you're good to go. Well then, those are the honorable mentions. Let's properly start now. 14th century Europe. The 14th century in Europe was a relentless disaster parade that made life basically hell. The start it had was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which happened because nature threw a tantrum. A couple of years of non-stop rain drowned crops, turned fields into mud pits, and made farming about as effective as trying to farm on a sponge. Grain rotted, livestock dropped dead, and everyone was left scrambling for food like it was some medieval Hunger Games, except no one volunteered for this nonsense. Starvation was the vibe of the era, and it hit hard. People started eating bark, rats, and whatever unlucky creature wandered too close. Cannibalism popped up here and there, because when you're starving, suddenly eating Greg from the next village starts sounding reasonable. The rich hoarded what little food was left, which was exactly as helpful as you'd think, and the poor, also known as most of Europe were, for a lack of a better word, gazumped. Over 1 million people died from hunger and disease, which was an absolutely killer way to set the tone for the century. Then, just as Europe started crawling out of that mud-soaked catastrophe, the 100 Years' War rolled in like a drunken brawl no one could stop. It started in 1337 between England and France because two royal families couldn't agree on who got to sit on the French throne. A war over chairs. That's what this was. For over a century, they tore up each other's countryside, burnt villages, and slaughtered peasants who had exactly zero say in the matter. Meanwhile, knights and nobles pranced around in their shiny armor, pretending this was about honor or some bullcrap, while everyone else was just trying to survive long enough to bury their dead. Towns were pillaged, farms were torched, and the only thing thriving was misery. Both sides introduced new levels of destruction with fancy weapons like the longbow and gunpowder, proving that technology can really shine when it's used to ruin lives faster. And when there weren't battles, there were taxes. Lots and lots of taxes, because someone had to pay for all the fun the nobles were having. Naturally, it wasn't the nobles footing the bill, but the peasants who got broker than broke. Then, as if Europe hadn't suffered enough, the Black Death showed up in 1347 to really hammer the point home. The bubonic plague arrived on rat-infested ships and spread faster than gossip in a medieval village. By 1351, about 1/3 of Europe's population was dead. That's roughly 25 million people rotting in the streets, in mass graves, or anywhere there was space to toss a corpse. Doctors tried to cure it with leeches, bloodletting, and whatever nonsense they could pull out of their asses, but none of it worked. People got boils the size of apples, coughed up blood, and died within days. Whole families were wiped out, ghost towns popped up here and there, and the survivors walked around wondering what god they'd pissed off to deserve this. Priests bailed on their congregations, thinking prayer wasn't worth dying for, and flagellants started whipping themselves in public, claiming it would end the plague. Didn't end the plague. Laborers died by the thousands, leaving fields untended and cities crumbling. Landowners, who were used to treating peasants like disposable tools, suddenly found themselves begging for workers. Wages rose for the survivors, which sounds great until you remember how many people had to die for that tiny win. Meanwhile, Jews got blamed for the plague because apparently Europe never missed a chance to crank up the bigotry. Thousands were burned alive or exiled because nothing solves a health crisis like murdering minorities. With famine, war, and plague already wrecking everything, the 14th century decided to throw in some bonus. By the mid-century, the working class had had enough. High taxes, economic hardship, and general oppression pushed peasants over the edge. In France, the Jacquerie Uprising of 1358 saw angry peasants storming noble estates, burning castles, and murdering the aristocrats who'd been screwing them over for generations. The rebellion was brutally crushed because the nobles weren't about to lose their cushy lives to a bunch of starving farmers. 17th century Europe. Europe again? Damn, Europe can't catch a break in history. First up, the Little Ice Age, a lovely stretch of time when temperatures decided to drop like they had a personal vendetta against crops. Summers were too short, winters overstayed their welcome, and the whole feeding the population thing became a pipe dream. Harvests failed so often it was basically a tradition. People starved while the weather mocked them with frozen rivers and snowstorms in places that weren't supposed to have snowstorms. Bread prices shot up so high that eating became a luxury, and peasants were left gnawing on whatever they could find: roots, weeds, maybe a rat if they were feeling fancy. This mess wasn't just about hunger. Malnutrition weakened everyone's immune systems, making it easier for disease to sweep through towns like a medieval vacuum cleaner. If starvation didn't get you, some random illness probably would. And while everyone was busy dying or contemplating which shoe to eat next, along came the 30 Years' War to really kick things up a notch. Starting in 1618, this war was a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. But let's not kid ourselves, half the time, they probably forgot what they were even fighting about. Armies rampaged through Central Europe, leaving destruction in their wake. They torched villages, pillaged everything in sight, and left civilians to starve in the ashes. Mercenary soldiers, who were basically armed hobos with no loyalty, looted towns for food and supplies, which didn't do much to help the ongoing famine. Millions of people died, not just from combat, but from the side effects of war. Did Europe need more things to die from? Because the plague gave them all a round two. Outbreaks of the bubonic plague hit cities like Vienna and Milan, wiping out huge chunks of their populations. There weren't enough people left to bury the corpses properly, so mass graves became the go-to solution. Trade ground to a halt because no one wanted to touch goods from plague-infested cities, which was fair because no one wants a side of death with their fabric or spices. Cities became ghost towns as people fled to the countryside, thinking fresh air might save them. Fleas and rats had no problem relocating, and the plague just kept spreading. This one is new. Witch hunting. Heightened superstition, mixed with general frustration and paranoia, led to widespread witch trials. Women, mostly poor and old because of course they were, got accused of consorting with the devil for things like crop failures, bad weather, or just existing in someone's line of sight. They were tortured until they confessed to whatever nonsense the authorities wanted to hear, then executed in some of the most imaginative ways humanity's ever come up with. Burning, hanging. Watch any movies of the Saw franchise, and they probably did that to hunt witches. They swept across Germany, France, England, and elsewhere, killing thousands. Judges and inquisitors treated these trials like a sport, and the public treated executions like free entertainment. Is it just me, or the only way to live fine in old Europe is to be a noble? Mongol conquests. If you were unlucky enough to exist during the Mongol conquests of the 13th century, which I made you exist in by the way since you went through that door, tough luck. These were the glory days of Genghis Khan and his bloodthirsty crew of nomadic murder machines, the Mongols. They were systematically turning Eurasia into a post-apocalyptic wasteland with horses and arrows. If you're the kind of person who whines easily, you wouldn't last 2 minutes here. This is Genghis Khan. He had a cooler real name, Temujin. He took a loose coalition of steppe tribes and turned them into killing machines. By the time the Mongols were done, somewhere between 30 and 40 million people were dead. That's not a typo. They razed cities to the ground and salted the earth. If you're wondering how bad that really is, the population of the world at the time was around 400 million. Do the math. Roughly 1 out of every 10 people on Earth was wiped out. It all began in 1206 when Temujin got tired of being bullied by rival tribes and decided to unite them through the classic method of, well, killing anyone who disagreed. After rebranding himself as Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, he went to blow by everything within spitting distance. The thing was, Genghis Khan must have had a mouth every woman can dream of because he spat far. They left burning ruins and pyramids of skulls everywhere they went. Their first major flex was taking over the Xixia kingdom in 1209. These guys were no pushovers, but the Mongols introduced them to a fun new concept called total war. Siege warfare was their specialty, cutting off supplies, diverting rivers to flood cities, and using prisoners as human shields. If you weren't killed in the initial assault, you'd probably starve or drown later. By 1218, Genghis turned his attention westward to the Khwarezmian Empire, a wealthy trade hub in modern-day Iran and Central Asia. The Mongols initially tried diplomacy, sending a caravan to open trade relations. The Khwarezmian ruler, Shah Muhammad II, responded by killing the caravan and mutilating its members. Big mistake. This was one of the rarest times you see Genghis Khan at least pretend to be kind and you mess it up. Good thing, he pretended more by sending 3 envoys to sort things out. Sir! They just killed one and mangled the 2 other envoys. Ене новшнут мініте вчеріку нехер шалгашбайна, навшин цергецу глул. We're going to battle. Even the Mongols themselves weren't immune to their own chaos. The empire eventually fractured into smaller khanats, with the leaders often fighting each other for power. But before that, they left a pandemonium massive enough to turn countries into wastelands. Look at that, you're dead. Lamau. You'll live again anyway. Watch this. See? Anyway, the late Roman Empire. Starting with the crisis of the 3rd century from 235 to 284 AD, the empire did a speed run on self-destruction. In just under 50 years, Rome had about 26 emperors, most of whom died violently via assassination. 47 must have had a field day here. Nobody could hold power for long, and the whole thing turned into musical thrones, except with swords and a lot more backstabbing. This political instability left the empire looking like a chicken running around without its head, which isn't exactly ideal when barbarians are at your gates. The economy also decided to throw in the towel. Inflation skyrocketed because the geniuses in charge thought it was a good idea to debase the currency. Coins were basically worthless, trade broke down, and people resorted to bartering, which is great if you enjoy trading a goat for a sack of moldy wheat. To make matters worse, invasions from the Goths, Persians, and other opportunistic neighbors added a nice touch of destruction. It's hard to focus on your tax returns when an invading army is busy setting your town on fire. While Rome was still trying to duct tape its empire together, the plague of Cyprian hit in 249 AD and decided to speed up the process of collapse. This delightful pandemic killed millions, wiping out soldiers, farmers, and anyone who wasn't already dead from starvation or violence. People reportedly died so fast that there weren't enough living bodies to bury the dead ones. It's a little hard to run an empire when half the workforce is decomposing in the streets. The cause of the plague is debated, but it could have been something like smallpox or measles. The plague weakened the army further, and with fewer soldiers to defend the borders, those pesky barbarians started looking like the least of the empire's problems. Farmers were dying too, leading to, you guessed it, more famine. This was the kind of time when even surviving felt like a punishment. Speaking of barbarians, they were a full-blown apocalypse in the making. The Goths were particularly ambitious, sacking cities like a toddler destroying a sandcastle. By 410 AD, they even managed to sack Rome itself, which was a pretty big deal considering the empire had spent centuries acting like it was untouchable. The Vandals followed suit in 455 AD, proving that Rome was basically the world's biggest piñata at this point. And then there were the Huns, led by Attila, who rolled through Europe like a wrecking ball. Attila didn't bother with subtlety, always maximum effort. While the cities burned, the Roman infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, the works, started to crumble. The government couldn't keep up with repairs, and public services broke down. Even basic things like clean water and functioning sewers became luxuries. Disease, poverty, and hunger were everyday realities, and the average Roman citizen probably spent most of their time wishing they'd been born in literally any other era. The Western Roman Empire finally called it quits in 476 AD. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic leader named Odoacer, and that was that. Mid-17th century China. Well, you can call it the Ming Dynasty. This kingdom that ruled for almost 3 centuries was collapsing under its own incompetence. Internal corruption, a parade of clueless rulers, and unchecked power grabs turned the imperial court into a festering pit of dysfunction. While the elites were busy stabbing each other in the back for power and wealth, the countryside suffered from a combination of government neglect and natural disasters that seemed like nature was throwing haymakers every week. Massive floods wiped out crops, leaving people with empty stomachs and no way to feed themselves. Then, droughts showed up to make things even worse. Entire villages starved because the weather couldn't decide whether to drown them or dry them out. With no crops, no money, and no help from the government, peasants started losing their patience. Revolts erupted like popcorn popping in a microwave. Among these uprisings, one leader stood out, Li Zicheng, a former postal worker who traded in mail routes for rebellion. He rallied starving peasants, overran cities, and carved out his own little empire. While Li Zicheng's peasant army was tearing through the remnants of Ming authority, the court was too busy pointing fingers and arguing over who was more useless to mount any real defense. Meanwhile, up north, the Manchu people had their eyes on the prize. The Manchus, a nomadic group from beyond the Great Wall, had been biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to swoop in and grab control. That moment came in 1644, when Beijing fell not to the Manchus, but to Li Zicheng's rebel forces. The last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, had enough of the whole mess and hanged himself on a tree in the imperial garden. A real thanks-for-nothing moment. Li Zicheng declared himself emperor, but his new dynasty barely got off the ground before the Manchus made their move. They allied with a Ming general, Wu Songui, who wasn't thrilled about Li Zicheng's takeover. Wu opened the gates of the Great Wall, letting the Manchus march in practically unchallenged. Li's forces were no match for the Manchu military machine, which steamrolled their way to Beijing and kicked him out. Thus, the Qing dynasty was born, led by the Manchu rulers who would go on to dominate China for the next couple of centuries. If you weren't killed by a rebel army looting your village, you might get trampled by Manchu cavalry or swept away in one of the relentless floods. The Ming government, in its final throes, couldn't even keep the roads safe from bandits, let alone manage relief efforts for its starving population. And when the Manchus took over, they didn't exactly roll out the welcome wagon. Cities that resisted their conquest were often sacked, and massacres were common. Even before the final collapse, the Ming dynasty's problems had been piling up for decades. Emperors who preferred lounging around with concubines to actually ruling left the court in the hands of corrupt eunuchs and incompetent officials. Local governors skimmed off taxes meant for disaster relief, and the military was a joke. Soldiers went unpaid for months, sometimes years, and when it came time to fight, they were more likely to desert than stand their ground. Early 20th century. The early 20th century was, pardon my French, but a total circus. It started with the First World War in 1914, dragging over 30 countries into a massive slaughterhouse that lasted 4 years. If this guy, Gavrilo Princip, didn't shoot Archduke Franz Ferdinand, none of this would have happened. But he did, and it snowballed into one of the biggest battles ever. Nations like Germany, France, Britain, Russia, and Austria-Hungary threw themselves into the fight, dragging their colonies and allies along for the ride. Trench warfare became the meta. Soldiers dug into filthy ditches for months, fighting over a few feet of mud. Rats, disease, constant shelling, and the ever-present stench of death. Chemical weapons, like mustard gas, made their debut, adding an extra horror to an already god-awful experience. By the time it ended in 1918, the war had killed around 20 million people, including soldiers and civilians. Another 21 million were wounded, many of them permanently maimed. The Treaty of Versailles wrapped things up on paper, but left a mess of unresolved tensions that would bite everyone in the ass later, especially this guy. While the world was still staggering from the war, the Spanish flu pandemic hit in 1918. It started during the final months of World War I, spreading rapidly as soldiers returned home from the front lines. It killed fast and in massive numbers. Unlike most influenza strains, which tend to kill the very young and the very old, the Spanish flu went after healthy adults in their 20s and 30s. The virus caused severe respiratory distress, with some victims turning blue from lack of oxygen before dying within hours. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and medical supplies ran out. Governments, already dealing with post-war chaos, were caught off guard and largely useless. By the time the pandemic burned itself out in 1920, it had infected about a third of the world's population, about 500 million people. Death toll estimates range from 20 million to 50 million, though some figures suggest it could have been as high as 100 million. To put it bluntly, more people died from the flu than from the war that had just ended. Cemeteries couldn't keep up, and mass graves became a common sight. Public health measures like quarantines and mask mandates were met with varying degrees of compliance and outright rebellion, further spreading the virus. Then Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who couldn't lead his way out of a paper bag, abdicated after the February Revolution. A provisional government took over, but it didn't last long. By October, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, staged a coup and seized power. This set off the Russian Civil War, which pitted the Bolshevik Red Army against the anti-communist White Army and a whole bunch of other factions. The Civil War dragged on until 1923, leaving millions dead and the country in ruins. Between the fighting, starvation, and political purges, an estimated 7 to 12 million people lost their lives. The Bolsheviks eventually came out on top, but their victory was a bloody one. Are you ready for this? It's round 3, late 18th to early 19th century Europe. God damn it, Europe. What's the matter with you? Y'all are metaphorically imploding for almost a millennium already. A third of the video is about you. The French Revolution kicked off in 1789, and it didn't waste any time turning into a bloody free-for-all. Years of financial mismanagement, inequality, and the general incompetence of King Louis XVI led to a complete collapse of the monarchy. The people had enough of starving while the nobility threw lavish parties, so they stormed the Bastille and demanded change. What followed was the Reign of Terror, where revolutionary leaders like Robespierre thought the best way to ensure liberty and equality was by guillotining anyone who disagreed or looked like they might someday disagree. Thousands of people, including Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, were executed in public squares. The revolutionaries couldn't even get along with each other, so political purges became a favorite pastime. France was a revolving door of governments, each one more unstable than the last. While the French were busy murdering each other, the rest of Europe started freaking out. Monarchies across the continent weren't thrilled about the idea of revolutions spreading to their own countries. Coalitions of European powers, including Britain, Austria, and Prussia, went to war with revolutionary France, adding more bloodshed to the pile. By 1799, the French were exhausted, and into this mess walked Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon didn't waste time, called himself emperor by 1804, and set out to conquer Europe. The Napoleonic Wars, which lasted from 1803 to 1815, were basically an extended version of everyone fighting everyone else. Napoleon steamrolled through Europe, dragging millions of soldiers into battle. Countries were invaded, alliances shifted, and cities were razed. The battles were enormous, with hundreds of thousands of men killing each other in fields across the continent. The war culminated in 1812 when Napoleon made the genius decision to invade Russia. His army, over 600,000 strong, marched into Moscow only to find it abandoned and burned. Winter set in, and Napoleon's men started dying from starvation, disease, and frostbite. By the time he retreated, barely 10% of his army made it out alive. This was the start of Napoleon's end. He was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. By the time the dust settled, the Napoleonic Wars had killed over 3.5 million people and left Europe in shambles. While Europe was trying to recover from decades of revolution and war, nature just gave a gift that kept on giving. In 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted in one of the largest volcanic explosions in recorded history. The ash and gases from the eruption spread across the globe, blocking sunlight and lowering temperatures. The following year, 1816, became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed across Europe, leading to widespread famine. In places like Ireland, food shortages caused riots as people fought over what little grain was left. The famine was so severe that thousands of families were forced to sell everything they owned just to buy food, and many still starved. Diseases like typhus and dysentery spread rapidly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that followed. Please, Europe, get a hold of yourself and stop filling up the history books. Okay, we'll stop filling the books, but we'll dominate the national television with our news. Late 16th and early 17th century Americas. The late 16th to early 17th century Americas were a complete nightmare for the indigenous populations thanks to the arrival of Europeans. Colonization started with the Spanish and Portuguese, who weren't exactly known for their subtlety. Conquistadors showed up with swords, guns, and a level of greed that could rival any corporate CEO. Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro led campaigns that destroyed the Aztec and Inca empires, tearing apart entire civilizations for gold and power. By the time the dust settled, European settlers and soldiers had claimed vast swaths of land, killing or enslaving countless native people in the process. Diseases made the situation even worse. The indigenous populations had no immunity to diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, which Europeans casually brought with them. Smallpox was the deadliest, wiping out villages and entire tribes before many Europeans even made contact. The disease spread faster than the colonists could move, killing up to 90% of some native populations within a few decades. Survivors often found their communities shattered, their leaders dead, and their ability to resist colonization gone. Those who survived disease and conquest didn't exactly get a fair deal. The Spanish imposed the encomienda system, which was basically legalized slavery. Indigenous people were forced to work in mines, plantations, or for Spanish landowners, all under the guise of civilizing them and converting them to Christianity. Miners died by the thousands in places like Potosi, where silver was extracted to fund Spain's empire. Others worked on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, a system so brutal that life expectancy dropped to just a few years for many workers. Cultural suppression was the final blow. Indigenous religions were banned, their sacred sites destroyed, and their traditional practices labeled as pagan or devil worship. Spanish priests, like those following the orders of the Catholic Church, burned native codices and religious artifacts to erase their histories. Indigenous languages were systematically replaced by Spanish or Portuguese, and anyone who resisted faced severe punishment. Entire cultural identities were wiped out, with only fragments surviving through oral traditions or hidden practices. Now, how does it feel to be alive in the 21st century? Great? Not so good? Liberating? Whatever you feel about it, and however you feel about it, we're still going to have a spot in the history books one way or another. Probably for something revolutionary like the James Webb Space Telescope, or something completely stupid like Naruto running through Area 51. See y'all!